Thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. A Glimpse of the Kingdom can remain free because of generous donors like you. If you'd like to donate, feel free to do so online, or you can send payments through Facebook Messenger. Don't forget to tell your friends about it so that they can enjoy this ministry as well. Be sure to subscribe so that you don't miss any podcasts.
You can listen to my daddy every single day, like in the gym, in the car, or just at home. Glimpse of the Kingdom is awesome!
Hello, thank you for listening to A Glimpse of the Kingdom. I am David Pendergrass. Got a special treat for you today. I have a friend, Tasha, a family friend of the family that owns, is it 26 restaurants you own? 20. They do kind of start on some restaurants. We were talking the other day about a family trip she came home from, and it was really interesting because, and she'll say more in a second, but she has a family background that is relatives, some through marriage and some not, that are Muslim and some that are Jewish. And of course, they're a Christian family. And it was Jewish and Jewish Christian, or whatever, mixed with Muslim. Anyway, we were chatting about that. It reminded me of the podcast I did not long ago on Judaism. If you haven't listened, you go back and listen to a podcast I did. Some questioners asked me about Jews today. What do they think about Jesus, and do they do sacrifices? And so Tasha and I were having a great conversation. Well, all of us, our families, wife and everybody was. And I invited her to say a little more about that. And she had some more issues that came up in that conversation, that interesting family reunion vacation that I thought would be worth talking about. So, Tasha, if you want to give us some context and examples, and we can talk about what we were talking about.
Yeah, so I think that one of the biggest issues I had was when I spoke to one of my family members. She had said that, I said, well, don't you feel like you're redeemed when Jesus came and had his return? And she said, well, he didn't save us from God's law. And she'll quote Deuteronomy and Leviticus quite often, but then her biggest thing was saying that he did not save us from the Shabbat and the Sabbath and not eating pork and various things that they believe and they still honor today. But she said that he did not save us from God's law, and he saved us from himself or ourselves.
Now, isn't this a person a Christian now?
Yes, she is.
Is she Gentile or Jewish by ethnicity?
She's Gentile.
Gotcha. So this is what a person, I know you've told me before that she self-identifies as a Messianic Jew. If you're not familiar, listener, to that term, if you've heard it before, Messianic Jew means a person who is Jewish by ethnicity. So think DNA. Their literal physiological DNA is of a typical, fit in the category of what we call Jewish heritage, genealogy. And they believe that Jesus is the fulfillment of the Old Testament promises of a Messiah. So that's what they call a Messianic Jew. You could also say Christian Jew. The reason why we say Messianic Jew versus Christian Jew is because, and this is unfortunate in my opinion, most people around the world, Jew and Christian alike, when they say Christian, they typically picture and mean a Gentile. And that is precisely what Jews believe. When Jews, as I said in a former podcast, when Jews says the word Christian or Jesus or New Testament, they associate it with Gentile. Secondly, I didn't say this in the previous podcast, but I'll say it now. Most Jews, when they think of Christianity, do not think of three branches of Christianity or Protestants. They think Catholic. They think Roman Catholics are the church, and the church is full of Gentiles for a Gentile religion. So when Jews, who are Jews by birth, believe in Jesus the Messiah, they won't call themselves typically Christian because it implies they are Gentile, which of course is false. So in that sense, the Apostle Paul was a Jewish Christian. All the earliest disciples were, Messianic Jews. Saul Paul was a Messianic Jew. The earliest disciples were Messianic Jews. The first generation of Christians were all Messianic Jews, to use that vocabulary, until Gentiles came into the fold when, particularly Paul, but not solely, but particularly Saul Paul, when he went and did his Gentile mission. And that's what's so distinct and got Paul in a lot of trouble by fellow Messianic Jews, is they didn't want Gentiles to come into the fold of a Jewish faith, which is Christianity. And the issue then is, well, do they have to be circumcised or not? Do they have to have Shabbat or Sabbath or the holy days or kashrut, dietary restrictions. So today, if a person is a Messianic Jew, it means they're Jew by ethnicity, they believe Jesus is the Messiah. And it often has the corollary practice, which is what you're talking about here in your relative, which is they typically uphold Old Testament Levitical regulations as binding today. That is very similar to Seventh-day Adventists, but they tend to be Gentiles who are Christians who hold to Old Testament regulations. So Messianic Jews and Seventh-day Adventists have that in common, but their ethnicity is typically different. So does that make sense? So the Seventh-day Adventists tend to be Gentiles by birth. That's the rest of us. But they all do believe it. So yeah, like you were saying, so that's the background for my podcast listener. And the question is, so the issue there is Jesus did not come to save us from the Old Testament law. Was that the right quote, basically? Yeah, the answer to that is, that's a really good point. I find that response fascinating on multiple levels. I really do. And one, of course, my chief thing usually is historical. That's the exact same thing addressed in the New Testament. The number one chief, and I've said this in other podcasts, and I'll keep repeating it. It's very important to understand, particularly if you've not read your New Testament before. The number one theological drama that caused all the church splits in the first few decades of the birth of the Jesus movement was this issue. Since Jesus died and rose from the grave, what do we do now with the law? They would not have said, what do we do with our Judaism? Because these are Jews who believe Jesus was Jewish, and he was and is, and he is the fulfillment of the law. The reason why this became such a massive deal and church splitter is, like I just said, is we have Gentiles wanting to come into the faith. And the church was divided. There were Jews who believed in Jesus, Messianic Jews, who said they need to come through Judaism, and others who said, no, you don't. And Saul Paul, and apparently the earliest Jewish leaders he called them the pillars in Galatians, they disagreed with their Jewish brethren. They're all Jews. It's an intramural, interfamily debate on what it takes to be a Jesus follower or part of the people of God. And in Acts 15, we have the so-called Jerusalem Council, and this is the most significant meeting, absolutely the most significant meeting of the early church movement, because they decided that Gentiles do not need to be circumcised. They do not need to obey all the Old Testament laws in order to be a disciple of Jesus. In other words, they decided the answer to your relative's question, probably around the year AD 50. That's been settled for over 2,000 years. That is, if a Gentile comes to the faith, they do not need to act according to the Levitical codes. Those are no longer, let's say it this way, they are no longer morally binding. What you need to do is stated in Acts 15. So I'll just read this from Acts 15:19. They have this long talk and it says, "Therefore I conclude that we should not cause extra difficulty for those among the Gentiles who are turning to God." The expression turning to God became somewhat standard expression for what we call conversion. There is no Greek word for conversion used in the New Testament. And so they would use words like turning to God. It's exactly what Paul says to the Thessalonians, almost the same time period, when he says, that everyone's heard about how you've turned away from idols to the true and living God. So anyway, he says, we conclude that we should not cause any extra difficulty for those who are turning to God among the Gentiles, but that we should write them a letter telling them, and here it is, to do what? To abstain from things defiled by idols. That's basically every other religious practice they know of. That's what that means, from idols. From sexual morality, which is probably associated with the religious festivals, but not necessarily. And from what has been strangled, and from blood. Now that probably does mean, of course, those animals sacrifices associated. That's it. So basically, don't have any kind of sexual relationship outside a man and woman in marriage. That's what any Jew would have said. And don't go to their religious practices anymore. That's it. And this is what they did. They read this. Verse 21, for Moses has had those who proclaim him in every town from ancient times, because he is read aloud in the synagogues every Sabbath. Then the apostles and the elders, the whole church, decided to send men chosen from among them. Judas called Barsabbas and Silas, leaders, to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas. And they sent this letter with them to where all these Jews were so ticked off. They read the letter aloud with the representatives, and it says they cheered. They went crazy. They were so happy. It says that in verse 31, when they read it aloud, the people rejoiced at its encouragement. So what they decide there, and it seems to have been quite historically accurate, because from there in the Apostle Paul's letters, and not to mention the Gospels themselves, we have no indication that Gentiles are ever required to do things that are morally binding, because they would demonstrate that Jesus' death is not significant enough. You have little exceptions, like at the very end of the book of Acts, when the Apostle Paul is traveling with Timothy, who was born a Greek, and they say you ought to get him circumcised. And that's only because some people who hated Paul and his movement said that Paul was telling people to abandon the temple and abandon Judaism, which he was not to Jews. He was never telling them to abandon it. So he said, well, go have Timothy circumcised to help them calm down. And that doesn't help, because he goes to the temple for purity and he gets arrested. So Jews probably did circumcise their sons, but it was not for religious reasons anymore. So what's so fascinating to me about your relative's comment is how relevant that is to the discussion. And it was relevant almost 2,000 years ago, because it was the same sentiment, which is, no, Jesus didn't come for that. The Apostle Paul and the people of the Jerusalem Council would have looked at your relative sweetly and said, you're mistaken. Yes, it does. He has come, in fact, saved us from ourselves, and he has come to save people from having to obey the Old Testament laws as morally binding anymore. The second quick point I'd make is Jesus himself. And to save time, I won't do this right now. There are multiple verses that explicitly and implicitly state that Jesus thought that he and his teachings were the litmus test. They were the boundary. I can't help but think, like in Matthew chapter 11. Okay, Matthew chapter 11, verses around 24, 25 or so. And he's saying, I'm so glad that God has saved the wisdom he's given to children versus the wise. And in that, he says, he's in the Son. He's hidden these things from the wise and given to the Son for those who follow him. So you have these constant examples where if you choose Jesus, you're choosing God's side. If you don't, you're wrong. You'll be judged for it. What he doesn't do in Jesus' ministry, what he never does, ever, this is very important to understand, he never calls people back to a purity of the Old Testament Levitical codes. He did not sound like a priest. He didn't sound like a Sadducee. He didn't even sound sometimes like a Pharisee. Pharisees a little different there, but he sounded similar to them. They were different from Sadducees and priests. But what Jesus sounded like was a prophet, not a person who says, we've got to get back to Torah, people. We've got to get back to Leviticus. Haven't you read your Old Testament? Instead, what he did is, you got to come back to meet God through me. Well, if that's true, then what Jesus taught is paramount and is what's morally binding. And that's what most Christians forever have believed, that what Jesus taught supersedes anything in the Old Testament, because it is Jesus. If Jesus is just a dude, then he's just delusional or crazy or evil. But he wasn't just a dude. If he really was the God-man, and most Christians believe that, it would mean that whatever he teaches supersedes it. So most Christians historically have come to this precept, and it's this: if it is not restated by Jesus or the early church from the Old Testament, it's no longer morally binding. That's why we don't follow it. For example, Jesus restates 9 of the 10 commandments in different times. Or someone like in Mark 10, a rich man comes up and says, how do I inherit a good life, eternal life? He says, I've done this. Great. The one commandment Jesus never reinstates in any of the Gospels. You know what it is? It's the one that she brought up.
Oh.
Sabbath, Shabbat. He never says that. The closest he gets to it is in Matthew, when the people come to challenge him, and Jesus condemns it, says, you're so, I want to say hell-bent, heaven-bent, on doing everything right in Sabbath, but you ignore the weightier laws of justice, in quotes from Malachi. And what he doesn't say is, I agree, you're right, Shabbat is that important. He nods his head that, yeah, it's important, but you're missing out the weightier things. That's the only reference we get to Shabbat in the teaching of the gospel. And for me, that is not enough to say Jesus upheld the Sabbath. And I've heard people say, well, the Sabbath comes before the law, therefore it antedate or tithing. Personally, I don't find any of that convincing. And the early church didn't either. The early church didn't tithe. The early church didn't do that. Did Jews celebrate Shabbat or Sabbath? Did they in the first, second, and third? Yeah, they did. Gentiles didn't, as far as we can tell. But they did it because they were Jewish. If you live near the temple, you go there. But today, that's the distinction. So those are my two quick thoughts, fairly quick. Well, it's intriguing to me because it's a historical question, too, is because Jesus himself and the gospel present Jesus as his own teaching supersede the Old Testament unless he states it again.
So that brings up a good point. Since she holds such values with the Old Testament, I've noticed that when we were praying at dinner, if I was to pray, I would reference Jesus, and it could just be a preference, but she would never reference Jesus in our prayer. She'd always say Lord, Father, or Lord. And so then it brought to question for me is, does she not hold Jesus, because she does hold such values to the Old Testament, does she not hold him up quite up there with God? And then also brings questions and brings light to the situation of the Trinity. Does she not think that it's all confusing to me. So I even asked her, I said, well, Jesus came he came, obviously. And she said, oh, well, Jesus was there in the Old Testament. We believe he was there, but he was behind the scenes. And I was really thrown off by that. So I'm all kinds of confused on that one. But yeah, I did notice that. I was trying to pick a little bit and a little bit to understand, but it just kept getting worse.
No, that's a good point about the getting more confused. First off, I love the fact that, I really mean this, of course, that you asked her. That is the thing to do. And I say that on my podcast and in person all the time with people it is the very best method in finding out what a person believes is to ask. Not, well, here's what you believe, or here's what everyone believes in your group. Ask them. And that is the way to do it. So kudos and way to go over there. The second encouragement about that is, and I'm not being mean to your relative, this is just true of human nature, including Christians. They don't always know what it is they believe and why they believe it. So I have found myself asking him why, and I could see, I just the other day I had a great lunch with an agnostic. He may not be as full atheist, he's shifted and more open-minded, but just asking him why he believes something makes him nervous. But this happens all the time. Mm-hmm. So I do ask, but I don't drill him. I go, can you tell me more? And a pause, like open-ended, or help me, why is that convincing to you, or what evidence you have? And she might hit a dead end very quickly. But nevertheless, the fact that we ask is the way to do it. And you go, oh, okay, well, here's what I believe, and so forth. So that was really good. And as far as the Trinity, is exactly right. And the answer to your question is, my response is, the answer is, I don't know either, since she didn't tell you what it is she believes. If she were here, I would follow up and say, can you tell me more about Jesus? And I really would say, just like this, I would say, that's very interesting to me, and I really am genuinely curious. Can you tell me more about Jesus? I'm not leading you anywhere. I'm not about to jump on you. I'm just really curious. Can you tell me more about Jesus? Because I love talking about Jesus. I'd love to hear your view of him. Like, is he just a dude? Is he more than that? And I've said this. Does that make sense? And then just pause. But I keep telling them, I put my hands up like this, like you see me in the podcast. You can't see me, but Tasha can. But I'm trying to demonstrate deference and humility. Like, I'm just asking. Like, I'm not attacking. Mm-hmm. Some people are cool with that. Others get, mm-hmm. Wife Elaine gets real nervous if you bring up the why question. But that shows, I think, and then, of course, I really listening. I look in the eyeballs. I try, and I repeat back to them, oh, so you think, gotcha, okay. And you show you're listening, because you are. I'm not waiting to just go for the jugular. I really... But it is true. It's a great point. It's a good observation, too, that you notice that she didn't say Jesus. It makes me think when she says Lord, that she means Lord God, not Lord Jesus. Which means it makes me wonder if she thinks she's not praying to Jesus ever, but Lord God, or we would say God the Father. Lord God's fine too, and the belief that she thinks Jesus was always there behind the scenes, that's interesting to me. So behind the scenes means she probably has some kind of a high Christology. Now there are groups of Christians who do believe Jesus actually was there and behind the scenes and manifested himself. Some Christians say that in the Genesis text where Jacob turns Yitzhak, he's wrestling with some say that was Jesus. Some say in Daniel when he's in the lion. Some say that. I find none of the things convincing. I think that's all completely wrong. But there are Christians who think that. I understand why they're doing that. character that sounds like someone has God's prerogative, and I get it. I just don't find it convincing. I think that the incarnation, literally putting on flesh of Jesus in the what we call year 81, was a incredibly significant event. It was the time that the Word became flesh, just as John said. I don't think there was ever a Christophany or Christ appearance in the Old Testament. You can be a Christian and have that view. It's just I don't find it convincing. It's not, the Old Testament never says it's Jesus. I think Jesus became Jesus at the incarnation. He was, before that, didn't have the name Jesus. He was the Word. So she's not crazy to say that you certainly can be within line Christianity and think that Jesus is back there. When I say what I just said on a very different issue, and I've said this in Trinitarian studies, and this is on podcast, you can listen to I have a short 3 or 4 series on Trinity, maybe it's even three different weeks on it. But so when someone says, you don't think Jesus was back then? I go, well, being very specific, no. Jesus right now is a composite creature in that he has both human and divine nature. He has a soul and a body, and Jesus became Jesus and got the name Jesus in a soul body at the incarnation. Before that, he was not Jesus. He was just the Logos, the Word, the Son of God, but he didn't have a name which we know, and he didn't have human nature. And so when historians and theologians use the word Jesus, we mean immediately the historical reference. In theology, on the scholarship level, when we say the Son, it's to emphasize that nature of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, Trinitarian. So it's like, forget there's a universe. There's just God. We don't say, no one in scholarship ever says God and Jesus in the Spirit. Never, never, never. Because he didn't have that name yet. It's just God, the Father, Son, and Spirit. So nevertheless, you can be Christian and believe the Son is behind the scenes. Does that make sense? If you want to. I just don't find that convincing. But I certainly don't think Jesus was behind the scenes, because Jesus was an incarnation. And what was the other thing asked? What was is that all of them? Was that the addressing the two? Oh. The other thing was, I was going to say briefly is, you said the role of Jesus, she's quoting from Leviticus and Deuteronomy and so forth, but still in Jesus, and what's the kind of theology there? What's interesting is, and a lot of people don't know this, but there was a group of Jewish Christians, so Messianic Jews, that lived on for some time. After, if you remember, we talked about just a second ago, when the so-called Jerusalem Council met, and then later on the Apostle Saul and Paul went on and preached to Gentiles, and Peter did as well for a while, and so forth. That became the dominant understanding of Christianity. Not all Jewish Christians agreed. If you can imagine that, churches were still divided. So when the Apostle Paul will go to different towns, if there were Jews or even Jewish Christians in the church, they started a church. There were Jews and Gentiles in the same church that Paul founded, or maybe he didn't. They didn't always agree. The Jews in the church might say, no, I heard from Bob back in Jerusalem, this is wrong. And our Gentile brethren in the church are going to hell because it's not just Jesus. You got to become a Jew first. So it became a perennial issue that Paul had to face, the early church had to face, until really, quite frankly, it wasn't as pressing of an issue until really after the fall of the temple in AD 70. By the end of the first century, it wasn't that much of a pressing issue because the Gentiles just overwhelmed the church because it spread to the east and northeast and north to the Roman Empire more, and mainly they were made of Gentiles, not Jews anymore. And so it became not merely a pressing issue. They just, by numbers alone, like today, by numbers alone, Chinese outnumber every other race. So right now, Christianity is a Chinese religion, if you look at it that way. Well, in the first century, it was that way with Gentiles. By the end of the first century. Having said that, even though it's not a pressing issue, there were still Jews who were Messianic, they were Christians, who did keep following the law, like a Seventh-day Adventist or like a Messianic Jew. And we have some indication of their existence from people who wrote about them, but not from their own hands. That's a bummer. We have some, what we have are some narratives that talk about what they believed, and we just have to assume it's true, from a Christian historian named Epiphanius, who wrote around the 4th century, and then a couple other documents. But they write about this ancient group of people called the Ebionites. And the Ebionites were apparently Jews by ethnicity who believed Jesus was the Messiah, but they seem not to, first off, they didn't agree that you did have to be circumcised, you did have to obey the Old Testament law. They also seem to have had a high view of Jesus, but not the highest view of Jesus. So these Ebionites were people who believed Jesus was the Messiah and was resurrected and is Lord, but they almost certainly would not go to the level of saying he was pre-existent and he was creator and so forth. And when you're talking about your relative, it reminded me of the ancient Ebionites. That is, that's what it reminds me of. That basically died out. At least by the end of the 4th, 5th century, they were over. Little footnote, people like Bart Ehrman, who was a former Christian, and now he's a well-known atheist who hates talking about, well, he talks about God all the time, but he's very much against it, any kind of religion. But he loves to cite the Ebionites as an example of how the Christian churches got so far off track that they squashed the Ebionites and whatever. But that's just not true. At least we have no evidence that the Ebionites were ever squashed. They probably just kind of died off because it, just by numbers alone, just outgrew it. So there is historical precedent for people being Christian who believe in very, very high views of Jesus, and we call those people were called adoptionists historically because they believe that God the Father adopted Jesus at his baptism. Little footnote, if you didn't know this is the origin of the Christmas date. In December 20, well, in the region, there was one guy who, Epiphanius, if I recall his name off, of course, all the top of my head, but I think it's Epiphanius. He argued that he was an adoptionist. He believed that Jesus was adopted because today I have begotten you. It says that, right? And of course, he's quoting from Psalm 110, but nevertheless, no scholar today, no one thinks it literally means all of a sudden now he's deity, but rather he's quoting from an enthronement psalm. It doesn't mean literally he's begotten, he wasn't born, he wasn't whatever. It just means his way of saying it's demonstrating you're my, you're kingly. Well, not all Jews believe the same thing I just said. They interpret it differently. They said, no, that was the day Jesus was just a good Jewish dude. Then God the Father did something special. He adopted him as a son on that day. And for whatever various reasons, they said the day that happened was on January 6th. January 6th. Well, when the Roman Catholic Church came around, again, Dionysius II, he was asked by the Pope to come up with a date for Christmas. And for various reasons, there's a lot of reasons, but he came up with December 25th. Probably because they believe that March 25th was the first day of the universe, because that's well, they thought it was spring equinox, the first day of the day of the longer part of the day. Mm-hmm. So metaphorically, the first day of the sun is longer, the day is longer. Yeah. It's like when the light of the world was born. Yeah. And so 9 months later, that was conception. 9 months later, he's born on December 25th. And nevertheless, to baptize that heretical view of January 6th, they kept the date but changed the significance to say, no, it's a day of Epiphany, day he was revealed, not adopted, but it was revealed to the world that he's now has a mission, and that became the day they celebrated his baptism. So it's still the day they celebrate his baptism of John the Baptizer. Behold the Lamb of the world who takes away the sins of the world, the Lamb. That's what John the Baptizer says in John's Gospel at the baptism. So say it's the day he's Epiphany. Epiphany means to be revealed. It's manifested like, oh, that's what John at his baptism. But that's a throwback because that's what these adoptionists said. Mm-hmm. And they said, no, it's just the day he was revealed as God's son. So he was born on the 25th. 12 days later, metaphorically speaking, he's revealed. Now, the Orthodox Church still says, no, they combine the two. They say January 6th is the day we celebrate his birth and his revelation. But nevertheless, the roots of January 6th come from what we now call heresy. But the time period was one small strand of early Jewish Christianity that said Jesus was really, really cool and special. He was the Messianic, he was anointed, but he wasn't God kind. And that's what the early church through the 3rd, 4th, 5th century overwhelmingly disagreed with. They overwhelmingly said, yes, he is. And the number one reason they thought that was because the Bible seems to present him that way. They prayed to him, they sang songs to him as God, he forgave sins. They thought they were being dishonest, unfaithful to the text by saying he was just a very special dude who got adopted by God the Father. And they said, if that's the case, he's just a creature and creatures can't save. But Jesus saves. Mm-hmm. Not even super creatures, but only God saves. And if God saves, Jesus has to be God kind. And then the issue with these creeds were, how do we articulate the fact that he is God kind without saying he's a creature, without saying he's God the Father? And so that was the difficulty. No extra charge for that extra. There you go. There's my. I had to say that for once in my entire life because no one cares, and that's what your PhD in historical theology will teach you, that you never get to use it for a podcast. So there we go. That's you're welcome. Can you pay me back some of my PhD? We'll wrap up there. It's been almost 30 minutes. Thank you so much, Tasha. You're wonderful. You did a great job. And next time we'll have to maybe talk more about how you had your Muslim relatives and what that was like. That was very interesting. That one next time. That's right. All right. God bless you. See you next time. Thank you so much for listening to the podcast. I really do hope that you enjoyed it. I hope you'll listen more. If you want more, go to davidpendergrass.com. There are tabs at the top that let you have access to all the podcasts I've recorded, to sermons I've done, books I've written. They're all there at davidpendergrass.com. You can also check me out on Facebook, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, facebook.com/glimpse of the kingdom, and also look at my Twitter feed at glimpse the kingdom or at Dr. D. Pendergrass, at Dr. D. Pendergrass. There's tons of ways reached out. I hope you will. Send me your questions, send me your comments. If you'd like to support the ministries of Glimpse of the Kingdom, you can also find ways to give online on davidpendergrass.com. If you'd like for me to come and do some consulting, check out my website, davidpendergrassconsulting.com, and I'll be happy to come out and speak to your organization and help and train any way I can. God bless you. See you online.